CD number 5.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلواته وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين على سيدنا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وصل اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله أما بعد.
Is there any question about the reading? 30, I think, to page... I'm going about 30 pages a week. And if we maintain that pace, we'll be able to complete the book in that time. So the reading should have been from the chapter entitled The Pact of Chivalry. Through to Abu Jahl and Hamza, chapter 20. So chapter 12 to 20. Or chapter 11 to 20. Now the section on this book, a lot of people find it difficult because of the names. It is a problem. And you know, it would be really nice if somebody actually went through the book, wrote down all the names, and then had a glossary of names that you could kind of keep with you as you read the book. That would be really useful. Because the names, and another problem, some people have the same names, and sometimes he doesn't really tell you which, he doesn't give you the full name in Arabic. So, and I'll try to do that for those names that he mentions. But yeah, it's really useful to keep the names because, now the other thing that's important, you should really read his seerah once a year. The whole thing. At least once a year. What's that? Yeah, the story of the Prophet ﷺ should be read at least once a year. Traditionally, the Muslims tended to read it in the month of Rabi' al-Awwal. Yeah. But it should be read at least once a year. So you get used to the names and the things. Now, the Hilf al-Fudul is a very interesting event in the Arab history. And the reason for it is there was an event that took place which the Arabs had an extraordinary sense of wafa, this idea that really your word was equivalent to you. If your word was sound, you were sound. If your word wasn't sound, you weren't sound. And so the Arabs really had an incredible dislike, like most people, for things like treachery, khiyana, very wretched. But at the same time, they were really a nomadic people that had only recently settled. They didn't really have a civilization like other peoples. And for that reason, their laws were not developed. They had pretty crude tribal laws. And in a lot of ways, it's not all that dissimilar to the laws of the street in some communities, for instance, in America, right? In other words, you have gang culture, and in gang culture, you have a gang, and the gang's tight, and the gang, they defend each other, irrespective of whether they're right or they're wrong. So if another gang takes out a gang member, then that gang member goes and gets revenge, irrespective of whether the person did it or not. Right? And this is a Jahiliyyah phenomenon, and it's called Tha'ar in the Arab tradition. So here, what happened, one of the things he mentions is that as the Prophet ﷺ was growing up, he was trained in war, which is important. And I'd just like to mention something about that. I think Muslims tend to have an idea that these Arabs, when time for jihad came, they all kind of just went out to fight, which is not true. And anybody who knows anything about martial arts knows that if you don't train, you lose it, right? Your body is not strong, your reflexes aren't the same, and any warrior knows that they have to continually train, which is why armies train every day, right? I mean, they do. They basically train every day, shooting, running, doing all these things. And so these Arabs, because their life, you had to be able to defend yourself. Because somebody might throw down the gauntlet and say, let's go. And so part of being a man in that culture meant that you were strong and that you had muru'ah, that you were able to defend yourself. You weren't a weakling. And weakness was seen as a very negative quality. So these people were physically very fit. And they were hunters. They used bows. They used to go out and practice in bows. The Sahaba used to practice in Medina. They used to practice between Asr and Maghrib. They would shoot the bows. And the Prophet was a great bowsman, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he said in a hadith, whoever learns archery and then leaves it has disobeyed me. He felt that you should continue, if you're going to do that training, that you should continue it. So they were trained in swordsmanship. You had to know how to use a sword. And a sword, you can't just pick up a sword. If you've ever done any kendo or eskrima or any type of where you have a weapon like a sword, or you'll know very quickly that you have to train because somebody comes at you, So they definitely did that. Now, Abbas radiallahu anhu and Hamza was an extraordinary powerful man. He was also a warrior by nature. That was just part of his nature. So he was very well trained in these arts, and it would have been a normal practice for him then to have trained with his, he's his brother in Rada'a, the Prophet. He's the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, but he's also his brother in Rada'a. So as an uncle, he's going to have a status like the father, even though they're almost the same age. And as a brother in the Rada'a, there's another bond there. So Hamza radiallahu anhu was very close with the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ, although being of average height and weight, to say that he was of average strength, I don't agree with that. Because the Prophet had the strength of 40 men. And so to say that, I would not, you should kind of put a cross through that. He was not of average strength. He wrestled the greatest wrestler in Arabia who'd never been thrown ever in his life. And he threw him twice. And the first time, the man jumped up and said, do that again. Because nobody'd ever done it, right? And a wrestler told me he wanted to learn the move, right? How did he do it? He wanted to see him do it again so he could learn the move. So the Prophet ﷺ had the strength of 40 men. But he definitely had an aptitude for archery, and partly because, like he points out, is true, he had very powerful eyesight. He could also see from behind like he could see in front. And whether that was before or after the prophecy, I don't know. But he could see behind him, and a man once was making fun of the way he walked, because the Prophet ﷺ walked fast and in a downward incline. And the Arabs tend to have a tabakhtur. They like to walk with a kind of, just like a tough guy type walk. And that's how they did walk. And so this man was imitating the way he was walking in a funny way. And the Prophet ﷺ saw him not like that. And he turned around and he said, be like that. And the man had like a paralysis for the rest of his life. He couldn't... And that is true that the Prophet ﷺ counted, I've seen 9, this says 12 stars in Pleiades, which is called Thuraya. And there's only 7 visible ones. There's only 7 visible ones with the human eye, right? And he saw 12 in that constellation. which now we understand the possibility of that because of distant stars and things like that. But he said that during that time. So that's one of his mu'jizat, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he could see those. Now, during that time, the Arabs had a very interesting phenomenon, and that is, despite the fact that they fought, they had this understanding of 4 sacred months. And in those sacred months, you did not fight. In other words, these Huram months, they had an inviolability, which meant you could not, you had to wait until it was over. And this allowed them to make their pilgrimage. It allowed a safe movement of caravans. And they really respected this. And some of the ulama have indicated that this was actually in preparation for the whole concept of taqwa. Because the Arabs, interestingly enough, despite the fact they didn't have a divine revelation, they recognized that these months were sacred and we're not going to break this inviolability. And so they really kept to that. And if there was a breach in it, it was considered an incredible wrong in their culture. Now, what happens is a very tough man. He was really tough man from this tribe of Kinana, which was a very powerful Najdi tribe. This man Amir, what happened is he was actually jealous of him because he was given safety from one of the Arab rulers at that time. And he said, will you even make him safe from the Kinana? And the Hawazim tribe was a very powerful tribe in that area, and so was Kinana. And so what happened is that they went out on a journey together, and he got him drunk, and then he just killed him. Very treacherous thing to do. And what happened is that the man then went and took refuge, right? And he had his tribe behind him. But the Hawazim had allies, right? The Quraysh were involved as allies of Kinana. So they were actually allies of the tribe of the man who was treacherous. And what happened is that because of this alliance, they had to defend their men. This is part of the Jahili tradition. They had to defend their man against the Hawazim. And so this led to a fight, which is it's known as Harb al-Fijar. Right? And this has to do with the man, because it was from this treachery or mufajara of this man, who's Barrad ibn Qais, because he killed this other man, and it was done in one of the sacred months. It was done in the Shahr al-Haram. So the fact that he did it in the Shahr al-Haram and he was treacherous, it was a really bad thing to do. Despite that, the Quraysh got involved in it. And so what happens is it went on for about 4 years. And there were only actually a few days of fighting during the whole time. And this is part of they had a tradition in I think it was the Philippines, or maybe in Borneo. It's one of these islands that, when these tribes would go against each other, if it rained, they wouldn't go out because it would wreck the headdress of these warriors. And the Arabs were a bit like that. If things didn't, if it wasn't a good day to fight, they'd just call it off, right? So this is basically the type situation. Now, during that time, the Prophet ﷺ actually collected arrows for them. There was a battle in which he collected arrows. And there's also, it's said that he also actually shot some arrows on that. Now, the interesting thing that happens from this is that after this, not shortly thereafter, there was a merchant who comes, and he'd sold some goods, right, from a notable of the clan of Sahm. And then the Sahmi refused to pay the promised price. right? So this wronged merchant, he was a stranger in Mecca, didn't have any power and no tribe at this point to defend him. He went up to this mountain, Abu Qubais, which is where they used to go to give sometime talks, and in a very powerful rhetorical manner, he said, I've been wronged, and is there anybody in this city who has a sense of justice? And this had a powerful impact on the Quraysh. And so the Quraysh then made a promise, and this is the Hilf al-Fudul. And the promise was that anyone who was oppressed, that did not have somebody to do that, then they would all be for that man, irrespective of the tribe. And this is a major change in the psychology of these people, that they would support the Mazlum, even if it was against their own benefit. So this is a major change. You can imagine this is getting them prepared, really, for the concepts that Islam is going to bring, because this was very alien to this Jahili culture. And they did that, and they all went and they poured water over the black stone, and then each man drank the water, and they raised their hands and made an oath, right, that every act of oppression in Mecca, they would stand together as one man on the side of the oppressed against the oppressor, whether the oppressed were a Qurayshi or from somewhere else. So you have to understand the importance of this hilf. And then the other thing is, the Prophet ﷺ said about this, he said that I was present at an oath of allegiance in Jahiliyyah. Had I been called to it in Islam, I would have gladly responded. And this is also an indication that Muslims should be on the side of the truth, even if it's coming from non-Muslims. See, so again, it's letting the Muslims recognize that we should not be in a Jahili framework where I defend my Muslim brother against, say, a Jew or a Christian, when it's clearly the case that the Jew or the Christian is oppressed and the Muslim is oppressing. It's really important to recognize this. This is a radical change from the psychology of the Arabs. And the Prophet ﷺ is letting us know that Islam is no different. Don't make the Muslims into a tribe where you take vengeance for your brother Muslim if he's an oppressor against an oppressed. And there's some really interesting stories in the Sirah about the Prophet supporting the non-Muslim against the Muslim when he saw that it was wrong. And Umar radiallahu anhu does this also, and this occurs several times in the history of Islam. So that's a really important aspect of this. And the man who in Mecca was a Taymi from the clan of Abu Bakr, it was in his house, Abdullah bin Jud'an, and he's the one that offered his house for all the lovers of justice, right? So calling people to this idea of justice. Now, the next section here is about marriage. And basically, it's interesting that the Prophet ﷺ had actually, there was a woman here who was of a marriable age named Fakhita. She's also known as Hani. And the Prophet ﷺ had actually grown up with her, knew her quite well. Now, Hani is, the Prophet ﷺ, his cousin Hubayra was the son of the mother of this clan of Makhzum, and he asked for the hand of Hani, right? And he had a lot of substance, he was a poet, he had all of these things. And so he was given in marriage, and the Prophet ﷺ, his request was unanswered. When the Prophet went to him, he was told that a generous man must requite generosity, and this was the excuse that was given. But Hani she comes up later in the story, and she's an important woman. Now the other here, which is very interesting, is Khadija radiallahu anha, who's bint al-Khuwaylid, and Khuwaylid was of the Asad clan, and there's many people, again, that are related to her that are important both against the Prophet ﷺ and for him. And she was the first cousin of Waraqa, who has the knowledge of the books. And this would probably mean that Khadija had heard from Waraqa during this early period that there was a prophet coming. And then we also heard about Qutayla, who's very interesting, who's the sister of Waraqa, and she actually wants to marry Abdullah. We heard that earlier, that she wanted to marry Abdullah because she recognized that this might be the man who has the prophet in his loins, or he might himself be that man, and it didn't happen. So basically, the Prophet ﷺ is now becoming known as Al-Amin. He's a young man, he's trading in the community, and Khadija actually employs him. Right? Oh, the other thing here that's mentioned is that the Prophet ﷺ, at going to Busra, which is in the south of Syria, he took shelter beneath the tree, and there was another monk there. Now, this might be the same place. The people of Sirah differ on this. Some say it might be the same place where Bahira was, and others say this is actually a different event. In any case, the Prophet ﷺ sat under this tree. And when Nestor saw this thing, he went and he said, only a prophet sits under this tree. And some say it was a tree that Isa ﷺ had sat under. So when he saw that, he asked the servant, Maysara, who was Khadija's servant, who is this man? And he said, he's from Quraysh, the people of the sanctuary. And he said, he's a prophet. So now Maysara, he wouldn't be that surprised because he's seeing some pretty extraordinary things on this journey with the Prophet ﷺ. The fact that he's clouded, the fact that there's barakah in everything that he does, even the goods that they purchase and sell, he makes much more than anybody else Maysara had ever gone on a journey with. And so what happens here is, now another thing, I think this is a really good footnote here, is that the Prophet ﷺ is identified by some of the Muslim scholars to be Shiloh, who's mentioned in Genesis 49, 1 and 10. And this is a really important verse because although the Christians interpret it to mean Christ, if you look at this, it says here, quote, and Jacob called unto his sons, which is Yaqub, and this is the 12 tribes are coming from here. He calls to the sons and he says, gather yourselves together that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. The scepter shall not, in other words, the ahad, this oath between God and between Bani Israel, shall not depart from Judah, right, from the Jews, nor a lawgiver from between his feet. In other words, all of the messengers are going to come from this tribe until Shiloh comes, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. So in other words, when he comes, the scepter is going to go from Bani Israel to another people. And then the gathering will be unto. So this is a prophet from Bani Israel foretelling a prophet who will not be from Bani Israel because it doesn't mean anything. The verse doesn't make any sense. Now for the Christians to say it's Jesus, Isa a.s. is a direct descendant of Dawood according to their own tradition. So he would have been from the children of Jacob or Yaqub. And so he does not fit into this category. So this is a really important event. Now what happens is when Maysara comes back, the Prophet ﷺ had an incredibly successful journey, and Khadija sees the truthfulness, Al-Amin, he's known as Al-Amin and all these things. She wants now to marry him. Now this is a woman who's been married twice before. She's 40 years of age, right? The Prophet ﷺ is 25, and she was a very beautiful woman, and she was still, according to the Sirah literature, she was still a beautiful woman. And she wants to ask the Prophet ﷺ for marriage. And also this is not unusual for a noble woman to be able to be forthright in that way. She was also not a virgin, and so the traditional restrictions or things like that would tend to be on a virgin in not being forthright or immodest would not be placed on her in a cultural context. So she gets a woman named Nufaysa, and she asked to go and see if this is possible. And Khadija told Waraqa, right, about, first of all, he saw these angels when they were on the journey, and then the other things that he sees. And she went and told Waraqa, and he said, if this is true, then he is the prophet that we've been waiting for. So this is an indication that Khadija radiallahu anhu was aware of who the Prophet ﷺ was. So anyway, the Prophet ﷺ he's orphaned, he's from Bani Hashim, they're weak, they're not what they used to be when Abdul Muttalib was alive, right? Abu Talib is poor, and the only of his uncles, the only one that was really doing well was Abu Lahab. So anyway, she's asking the Prophet ﷺ, and she's saying, she wants to, to see what's going on. And this is matchmaking and things like that. And so she's asking him, what do you think of a noble woman with wealth and all these things asked you for marriage? And the Prophet said, well, who would that be, right? And he said, I don't have the ability to marry and this and that. And she said, well, what if she wanted? And who is she? Khadija. And then he asked, how could I do that? And she said, right, leave it to me. And then he said that he would do that. So she goes, tells Khadija, and then things begin to happen. So Hamza goes and asks for the hand in marriage ibn Awwam, right? So there's a lot of really amazing connections here. Anyway, Hamza goes and he asks for the hand of Khadija, and it's agreed, and they'll give 20 she-camels, nuq, as a dowry. So now what happens, the Prophet ﷺ is establishing a household in this early community. And then from Khadija, alayhi salam, she gives 6 children, 2 sons and 4 daughters, right? Qasim is the firstborn. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ is named Abul Qasim, which again is a clear indication, because he actually says, Ana al-Qasim, right? He's the distributor. He's the one that yaqsim between people. And so Abul Qasim not only has that idea of being the father of Qasim, but also being the possessor of Al-Qasim, or the one who can do that, Abul Qasim. And he's also Abu Tahir and Abu Ibrahim. So he has Qasim, Tahir, and Ibrahim. These are the 3 sons. All of them will die in their first few years of birth. And then the daughters he has, Zainab, followed by 3 other daughters, Ruqayya, Kulthum, and Fatima. Right? And then on the marriage day also he sets free Barakah, who was a slave he inherited from his father. Again, the name is, I think, very interesting. I mean, his own slave's name is Barakah. And he sets her free. And Khadija also gave him the gift of a boy, Zayd ibn Haritha. And this is interesting too. Now at the time, Barakah she marries somebody from Medina. Yathrib, again, ties here, and has a son who's very important, Ayman. She becomes Ayman from the son that she'll have. And then Zayd, right, he was bought in Uqab by the uncle of Khadija here. But what happens, it's very interesting, or her nephew, this man Zayd was actually an Arab from the Kalbi tribe, which was a good tribe, and he was unjustly taken as a captive in they used to raid places and they would take captives, and he was sold into slavery, right? Haritha, his father, was of the Kalbi tribe there between Syria and Iraq, and then his mother was a Tai from Hatim al-Tai, from the same tribe of Hatim. So he was actually a noble from good birth, but what happens is he lives in this area. Now, this is an incredible event, I think, personally. What happens is Zayd, radiallahu anhu, is growing up here in the house of the Prophet ﷺ, and Haritha, his father, is looking for him, and then finally gets news from some pilgrims, because Zayd meets some Kalbis on pilgrim, and he has to tell them, because it would be a disservice, even though he's actually very happy where he is. He tells them, and the news gets wind to his father, And he comes with his uncle. And they come and they meet the Prophet ﷺ, and they explain to him what happened. Now here's somebody who was purchased, given to the Prophet by Khadija, and this is in the Arab situation, really kind of acceptable condition. So he says, let Zayd choose. I'm not going to. They say, we'll ransom him. We'll give you money. See, so they're recognizing, this is an unfortunate situation. We'll pay you for him. The Prophet ﷺ says, we'll let him choose. If he wants to stay with me, then he stays with me. If he wants to go with you, no ransom. And this is part of his justness, the Prophet ﷺ's fairness. So they bring Zayd to the Kaaba, and he meets his father. He recognizes him, his uncle, and he said, the Prophet ﷺ explains to him the situation, and Zayd radiallahu anhu, he says, I would choose no man over this man. Which is amazing because this is his father, who was a good man. He's been spending all this time looking for his son. So again, this is a clear indication of who the Prophet ﷺ is. Because here's a man in his house, his slave, he's mamluk, and he's choosing to stay with the person that owns him over his freedom. And his father says, وَيْحَكَ يَا زَيْدٍ. Think about what you're doing. أَتَخْتَرَ الْعُبُودِيَّةَ عَلَى الْحُرِّيَّةِ. Do you choose to be a slave over freedom? And he says, I've seen things from this man, I can't leave him. So they leave, and at that point, the Prophet ﷺ announces to the Quraysh, Zayd is my son, right? Zayd ibni. So this is called tabanni in the Jahili, which again is a really significant event. He says, this is my son. أَرِثُهُ وَيَرِثُنِي. I inherit him and he inherits me. And from that day forward, in the Jahili period, he's known as Zayd ibn Muhammad, no longer as Zayd ibn Haritha. Now what happens is, he mentions about the drought and these things and the difficulty that Halima has. And then what happens is Quraysh is suffering because of the difficult weather and things. And Abu Talib has his two sons, Ja'far and Ali, who are very significant also later on. And the Prophet ﷺ agrees with Abbas, his uncle, to relieve Abu Talib, because he had a lot of children. So the Prophet took Ali, and Ali is a child now, small boy. And Fadl, who's the mother of Abbas, who's one of the first people, she has always loved the Prophet ﷺ incredibly. They decide to take Ja'far. And so Sayyidina Ali now becomes part of the Prophet ﷺ's household. And then Barakah comes back to the house. And then another important event happens, which is Abu Lahab proposes to the Prophet ﷺ for his two sons, Utbah and Utayba. And Ruqayya and Kulthum are both betrothed to Abu Lahab's sons. Now this is important for a number of reasons. One, there's a recognition in Bani Hashim now that the Prophet ﷺ is a za'im. Even though he is not somebody who is in any way asking for this position. He's not somebody that's out there, rallying Bani Hashim to take what's theirs, which is the leadership of Quraysh. But they all recognize there's something extraordinary about this person, the sagacity of his intellect, the wisdom that he has, his abilities, the eloquence of speech. Although he spoke very little, when he spoke, everybody recognized that he had an eloquence that was unmatched in Quraysh, despite the fact that he's not speaking poetry. And so Abu Lahab is obviously here trying to get in, right? Because to marry his children to the daughters, in their culture, you're marrying also for social positioning. And so the Prophet ﷺ at this point is really not somebody that looks in terms of his material well-being. He's got some money now because of Khadija, but he's not a Makhzumi, he's not from the stronger tribes, he's not a Shamsi or an Umawi, he's a Hashmi. And although there's a blood bond here with Abu Lahab, despite that fact, Abu Lahab, I think really, and he indicates this, is looking for some benefit here. And so he marries, the Prophet ﷺ agrees to them, and they become part again of the household. And this will create a problem later on. We'll see that when Abu Lahab becomes such a vehement enemy of this, causes a lot of turmoil for both Ruqayya and Kulthum because of they're married to Utbah and Utaybah, and their fathers become one of the biggest enemies. Now, another event that's really important here is when the Prophet ﷺ is 35 years of age, the Quraysh are going to rebuild the Kaaba. And the Kaaba was, according to their tradition and according to our belief, was built by Ibrahim alayhi salam. But to touch it in any way that was harmful was considered an incredible sacrilege. And so they're actually very worried about doing this. And does he mention about Walid ibn Mughira? Not sure if he did. Yeah, Mughira. Walid ibn Mughira, who's very tough Qurayshi, they're all afraid to lay a hand on the Kaaba. And what happens is a snake is coming out every day when they go to do this. It's a mean-looking snake, and they take it as an omen, we shouldn't be doing this. Right? And then one day a bird comes and takes the snake off. And so they say, okay, now we've got permission. But they're all still really afraid. And Mughira goes up there and he says, La tar'a, don't be worried, to the Kaaba. He said, this is for your benefit. And he takes the first strike. What they do is decide to wait a day and see if Mughira drops dead or not. Right? And in the morning, Mughira's all right. And so they begin the rebuilding of the Kaaba. Now, he mentions also in here now that the Prophet ﷺ, the important note, is that at the point where they finish rebuilding the Kaaba, and there's also something he doesn't, I don't think, mention in there, which is really significant, is that the Arabs collected the money for the building of the Kaaba, but it was on the condition that the money had no interest in it. It had no the price of a prostitute, and nothing. There could be no haram. So it's a recognition. They knew that interest was not a good way of making money, and so they were unable to complete the building on the original foundations of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and that's why you have that Shadirwan, which completes the foundations. And so when they were arguing about who's going to put the black stone, which is the most sacred stone in the Kaaba, who's going to put that in place, in the cornerstone, they start arguing, and each clan is saying, we're more rightful. So the Taimis want the honor, the Makhzumis want the honor, the Sahlis want everybody wants the honor. So they decide, the first person that comes through the Kaaba, we'll let him decide. And sure enough, the Prophet ﷺ comes in, and they all see the Prophet, and they say, Radayna bil Amin. Let Amin decide. So in other words, here's again an indication, because these are the A'yan. And remember, these are older men. The Prophet ﷺ is still a young man. He is not fully, because it was a society based on elders. So these are going to be men in their 50s and 60s who are tribal chieftains. Right? So the fact that the Prophet ﷺ is a young man coming in, he's not fully admitted into this group yet. I mean, they see he's up and coming, right, leader, but he's not really admitted into the group. So that's important to recognize their psychology. But when they see him, Radayna bil Amin, they recognize this, we're all content with this. He lays out the cloth, has each group pick a corner of the cloth, they lift it up, and then he himself places the stone in the Kaaba. Now what happens now is that the Prophet ﷺ begins to have dreams. And this is the beginning of prophecy. He starts having true dreams. And then at the age of 40, when these dreams begin to occur, he is going off to a place, Ghar al-Hira is just outside of, right, you have the city. Ghar al-Hira is a mountain. There's a cave at the top of the mountain, which is just outside the city, and you can actually see from the cave, you can see the Kaaba. I don't know if you can anymore because of the buildings, but yeah, you can see the Kaaba from the cave. So it's really not far outside of the city. The Prophet ﷺ would go to this cave, and according to the tradition, that he would do it for tahannuth. And hinth in Surah Al-Waqi'ah, hinth means shirk. So hinth is like idols. It's shirk. Tahannuth is from tajannub. It means to avoid the idols. So the Prophet ﷺ is going to this place outside Mecca to get away from the idols. And this is the Hanif tradition. And he's doing the ibadah that he was doing, his meditation in the cave, and he has a vision, which is that, I mean, not a vision actually, he sees the angel. So it's actually a clear seeing. The angel comes and tells him to read, and he says, "Ma ana biqari," I don't know how to read. Now it's important because the angel takes him and squeezes him until he thought his sides were going to burst. The ulama say one of the meanings of this is in recognizing the difficulty of the Quran. The Quran is not an easy book. It's literally going to squeeze the nafs, right? It's going to completely take you to a point where your nafs can't bear it anymore. And so he does that 3 times. And each time the Prophet says, "I'm not a qari." And qari, important to note, qari to the Arabs meant somebody who could read. I mean, generally they say reciter. But qari is an interesting word because it means both a reader and a reciter. The Quran is a recitation, it's also a reading. And so the qari, he was not a reciter. He did not recite poetry, the Prophet ﷺ. He was not known as a rawi or a qari, but nor could he read. So it really has a couple of meanings. And then the Prophet ﷺ is told by this angel in the form of a man that he's Jibreel, and this is prophecy. And the Prophet is in a complete, now he's actually terrified, and partly because he's worried that the Arabs believe that poets were often possessed by jinn, what they call in Greek tradition the muse, right? There's an idea in Greek tradition also that the poets they had a muse on the side of their, like Ta'abbat Sharra was a poet, that had this jinn that was like reciting to him. That was the idea. And so he was actually terrified that this was a jinn. He goes down to Khadija very significantly. He's shivering because of this experience. And you can imagine this is an incredibly traumatic experience for a human being to go through. And also because in somebody with the Prophet's, his absolute balanced nature is worried that, it's an unbalanced experience, right? It's uncanny. And so there's that element there. So I think we should all recognize that the Prophet ﷺ in this situation is really troubled by this. He goes to Khadija, radiallahu anhu, "Zammiluni, zammiluni," cover me up, because he's shivering. He's really traumatized by this experience. And then she asks him what happened. And he tells her what happened. Now Khadija, a couple of things. One, if we recognize that she was aware at a certain point this is going to happen, because she really did have a knowledge that the Prophet ﷺ was going to be a prophet. So she's not, now finally it's making sense. In other words, this really is what she's been waiting for. And she confirms it to him and tells him, reminds him, you take care of the orphan, you look after the widow, you give sadaqah, you give charity to people in need, and you help the oppressed. How could your Lord abandon you? In other words, doing all of these upright things, how could this be an evil experience? Because the evil influences in the world only have access to people that open up venues for them. And you have never left a venue open for them. So how can they, the jinn, have access to you? And then she says, let's go to Waraqa bin Nawfal. Now this is a really important and significant event also. Because one, it teaches us something really important. And that is, when in doubt, go to an expert. Right? فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. If you don't know, go ask somebody who has expertise, who's adept at the situation. And so they go to Waraqa bin Nawfal, and Waraqa, this is the namus. This is the sharia. This is what came to Musa. And you are a prophet. So he's confirming now. So now he has a confirmation from Khadija, and he has a confirmation from somebody who's an expert. Somebody, one, the most intimate and close person to him, his own wife, who knows him better than anyone else, human people. And then from Waraqa, who's an expert in the very thing that's happening to him. And so he tells him a few things that are interesting. One, your people are going to, they're going to harm you, and they'll chase you out of this city. And this is something the Prophet ﷺ cannot believe. Because, not that he can't believe it, but it's something so shocking to him, because he was somebody that never had a bad word for anybody. He'd never done anything to harm these people. He'd always been absolutely upright and just in their city and in their tribe. And so he's deeply shocked by that. And then Waraqa says that he hopes, even though he's an old man about to die, which again is really significant, that because, see, had he lived, what would have people said? What's that? That he taught him. See, had he lived, and this is what the Christians would have said, because they're always trying to find, where did he get this information from? Yeah, absolutely. So they'd say, oh, he had an aide. Waraqa bin Nawfal was with him throughout his mission, teaching him the Bible and the. You see, it's important. Waraqa dies immediately after this. But he says, and this is a proof he was a Muslim, he says, I would that I would live to be with you, to give you victory on that day. And then he kisses him. And then, so he's had these two assurances now. And then the next revelation, so the first one is Iqra. And then the next revelation is a single letter, right? Noon. And then وَالْقَلَمِ وَمَا يَسْطُرُونَ. So it's very interesting that the first revelation is Iqra, write, and then the second revelation is Noon, right? وَالْقَلَمِ وَمَا يَسْطُرُونَ. I mean, read. So here, the first two revelations are related to how we learn, right? Through reading and writing, right? Transmission of knowledge. And then waduha, there's a period, a break here, and a period. Now, what happens is the worship. The Prophet is commanded in the Quran, فَاسْتَعْ بِمَا تُؤْمَرْ وَعِرَضْ عَنِ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. He's told in the Quran, do what you're commanded to do, submit to it, and avoid the mushrikeen. In other words, don't fight them, don't do anything, just avoid them. And this verse in the Quran, once the Prophet was at the Kaaba, and he read that verse, and a Bedouin was there, and he went into sajda. And the Arab said, did you change your deen? And he said, La wallahi. He said, by Allah, I didn't change my deen. They said, why did you make sajda? He said, because of the fasaha of those words. The power of those words. He was just so impressed by that. فَاصْدَعْ بِمَا تُؤْمَرْ. He was so impressed by that it put him into sajda, which again, it's just telling us they really recognize the power of this book. So he's commanded to do that, and he says that the religion's based on ritual purification and prayer. Allahu a'lam. I mean, at this early period of time, even though he's commanded to avoid najasa, rijs, and these type things, there's really they're being taught tawheed. during this first period. And obviously they're making dua and these things, but the prayer is given to him later. And so he begins, the first to embrace it, according to our tradition, is Khadija. And Waraqa, although he's not generally placed amongst these, he definitely believed in the Prophet ﷺ. But from the Ali in the household accepts, and he's only 7 years of age, he's a small boy. And then Abu Bakr, who's his closest friend from the Taymi clan, he also embraces it. And Zayd, who's still the adopted son of the Prophet because that hasn't been abrogated. And then what happens is some of the others, like Abdu Amr is a very interesting person. He's known as Abdurrahman bin Auf later. The Prophet didn't like the name Abdu Amr, which is like a Jahili name. He gave the name Abdurrahman bin Auf. And he also becomes Muslim, which is important because he's one of the... See, these people that are with the Prophet at the very earliest point, these are the people that will be with him throughout his mission. And they're also people that were coming into Islam at a time when there weren't any perks here. There weren't any social benefits, right? This is all at a time when it was actually incredibly difficult to be doing it. So these people are really important, and they'll be important throughout the mission. Now, another person who, and then Khalid ibn Sa'id is important also. He had a dream in which he sees the Prophet ﷺ, he's about to enter into a pit of fire, and the Prophet ﷺ pulls him away from the fire. In a dream, he's seeing this. And then he goes, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu is known for dream interpretation amongst the Quraysh. And so he goes to him and tells him, I had this dream, explain it to me, and he explains that he becomes Muslim. And then another person is Abdul Shams, who's known as Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu, and he on his way back from Syria heard something in the desert telling him that the Prophet Ahmed has come, and he's asking, who's Ahmed? Right, which is something very unusual. And then he becomes a Muslim, right? Because he goes, and there's another man, Talha, also, who meets a monk who tells him that it's time for Ahmed to come out. The monk tells him the time has come for Ahmed to come out. And that's the name that the Christians had for the Prophet ﷺ. And so Talha ibn Ubaidillah, he is a Taymi also. Uthman is a Umawi. Is another clan, very powerful. And basically they go to Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and he explains. And Uthman submits. He's 34 years old when he becomes Muslim. So he's mature. He's not like a lot of these men who were very young. Zubair ibn Awam was 12 years old when he became Muslim. He just reached puberty. So a lot of them were very young. And then another one is Abdullah bin Mas'ud, who was he was a confederate of Zuhra, very dark-skinned, very short. He was very small, and he used to watch animals outside Mecca. And the Prophet is with Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and they pass by and they ask him for drink, and he says, I can't, I'm taking care of these, which is a sign of amana. Right? Nobody's going to see him giving some drink. It's a sign of amana. He says, I can't, it's a trust, they're not mine. So the Prophet asked for one that doesn't have milk. And so he brings it and he puts his hand on the udder, and the udder fills up. So here's a clear mu'jiza. Ibn Mas'ud sees that and then asks Abu Bakr, what was that? And Abu Bakr explains to him, he becomes a Muslim also. He's very important because he's going to become one of the greatest of the scholars in Islam, right? Abdullah bin Mas'ud. And he eventually goes to Iraq, becomes a teacher in Iraq, and Abu Hanifa radiallahu anhu's madhab is based mostly on his positions, fatawa. But he really is considered one of the greatest Muslims. And also, it says here, which is true, he's memorizing everything that comes down from the Quran. And he actually says at one point, there's no verse in the Quran that he doesn't know where it was revealed and why it was revealed. Right? So he saw very early on. And unfortunately, he had a mushaf that gets destroyed. It's lost. And they say there would have been an incredible amount of knowledge had we had access to that. And also Sayyidina Ali's mushaf, which went according to the revelation as it was revealed. And then there's a period in which Ya Ayyuhan Muzammil comes down, and also Ya Ayyuhan Mudaththir. And during this time, Khadija, it's beautiful, is given greetings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, also indicating her incredible rank amongst the women and amongst the men. And then really what's happening here now is there's not a whole lot of hostility yet, although it's starting to get out, the word's getting out. But then something very important happens, which is أَنذِرْ عَشِيرَتَكَ الْأَقْرَبِينَ. Allah commands the Prophet to warn his tribe, right? And this is a command. So now he has to go to his tribe. And what happens here is he calls the people, the Quraysh, to a gathering. Not Quraysh, Bani Hashim. And he tells them that the first time they eat, and then as he's about to talk, Abu Lahab gets them out. And so they all leave. He calls them another time, and again Abu Lahab, who's really just, he's not a nice person. I mean, that's the least we could say about him. And his face was like, they called him Abu Lahab because it looked like it was on fire. You know, subhanallah. But the Prophet ﷺ tells them that, what if I told you there was an army just over the hill about to destroy you? And they said, we'd believe you because you're al-Amin. No reason why we wouldn't believe you. He said, what if I told you that I was a prophet from Allah and I have to warn you from this fire, this raging fire? And then Abu Lahab says, Tabban laka. Alihada jama'atana, Tabban laka. Like, which is, may your hand be, lost. Is this what you called us for? And Allah reveals, Tabbat yada abi lahabbin wa tab, which is another really significant thing, because one, this is very early on, and that's an early surah, and had Abu Lahab become Muslim, right? I mean, this is a clear mu'jiza, because the Quran condemns him to the hellfire, and he doesn't become Muslim, right? Many of these people end up becoming Muslim. He never becomes Muslim. So he's commanded to do that, and then he says, will anybody, help me in this matter? And all of his relatives, I mean, you can imagine this, it's a devastating event. Because here the Prophet's gathered them all, they've eaten, they ate from a small amount of food that was enough for all of them. And then the Prophet says, will any of you believe in me and help me? They all blank face. Sayyidina Ali stands up. He's a few years old, he's probably now about 10 years old, and he says, I'll be with you and stand by you. And they all start laughing.